Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center. I'm Stephen Best. We're pleased to welcome Estelle Tarica and Debarati Sanyal to discuss Estelle's recent book, Holocaust Consciousness and Cold War Violence in Latin America. Estelle is professor and the chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the author of the previous The Inner Life of Mestizo Nationalism, which was released in 2008. She's joined by our colleague Debarati Sanyal, who's director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Critical Inquiry and a professor in the Department of French. I did want to mention the next thing on our calendar. That is the UNA's residency with the filmmaker Apichatpong Virasataku. The residency begins tomorrow evening with a screening of his film Memoria, which will take place in the BAM PFA Osher Theater at 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, yeah. Apichatpong's UNA lecture will take place next Tuesday, April 11th at 5 p.m., again in the Osher Theater at BAM PFA. And for that event, he will be in conversation with our colleague, Hilton Alls. For the other film screenings, films that are being screened during the residency, please check the BAM PFA website. So with that, I'll turn it over to Estelle and Debarati. We're looking forward to your conversation.
Okay, hi everyone. It is such a pleasure, for me to be in conversation with Estelle Tarica on her book, Holocaust Consciousness and Cold War Violence in Latin America, especially because we've been in dialogue about related topics over the years. But when I opened the book, I just learned so much about the Latin American context for Holocaust memory. So thank you for that, Estelle. So I thought that I would just say a few words about the book before we start our conversation. So as the title suggests, Estelle Tarica takes Holocaust memory into Latin America, a place where fugitive Nazi perpetrators found refuge, but also where intellectuals and activists made striking uses of the Holocaust to animate forms of political critique and resistance, as well as solidarity and national self-determination during the Cold War era in Argentina, Mexico, and Guatemala. Now, since the post-war era, the Holocaust emerged and arguably remains the paradigm for historical trauma and human rights violations. Some defend the singularity and incomparability of the Holocaust, which leads to paradoxes like the notion that the Holocaust is at once paradigmatic of human rights violations and exceptional or irreducible to other human rights violations at the same time, right? Others argue that the Holocaust serves as a kind of transcultural vector of memory and mobilization. And quite a lot of the scholarship has been done in the European context by people like Michael Rothberg, Astrid Earle, Max Silverman. Others still have examined the Americanization of the Holocaust. But what Estelle Tarica's book shows us is how complicated the uses of Holocaust memory were in Cold War Latin America, and its really unpredictable twists and turns as that memory intersected not only with ongoing patterns of anti-Semitism and other kinds of racialized violence, but also and primarily repressive political conditions. Rather than relativizing the Holocaust, comparisons with political repression in Argentina or comparisons with genocide in Guatemala, arguably very different forms of political and racialized violence, actually worked to counter Holocaust denialism while energizing left-wing and nationalist commitments. Rather than banalizing the Holocaust, as discourses of its radical singularity often claim, these comparisons banalize the violence in Latin America. One of the most compelling threads in your book, Estelle, is the tension between hero and victim in Holocaust commemoration, where the figure of the militant is often opposed to the figure of the innocent, frequently racialized victim, right? In France, for instance, the post-war figure of the resistance fighter during the whole, mobilization of resistance as France's disposition during World War II, which was not exactly the case, was, sort of displaced by the innocent Jewish victim. And this especially in the aftermath, and you discuss this in your book, of the Eichmann trial and its inauguration of what Anna Divioka calls the era of the victim. So, and similarly, Americanized versions of the Holocaust, especially after the memory boom 1990s, which you talk about a lot, have focused on trauma, melancholy, mourning, injury, and victimhood. And I'm also really interested in how 9/11 kind of energized that particular relationship to Holocaust memory. By contrast, what Estelle Tarica calls Latin Americanized Holocaust memory is far more political and attuned to struggle. And her supple, intricate case studies of its deployment show us that victim and militant were not mutually exclusive categories, either during the Nazi genocide, right? Note the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or the repressions, massacres, and genocides that took place in Cold War Argentina, Guatemala, and Mexico. And so this makes for really fascinating intellectual history of how Holocaust memory became thoroughly entangled with ideological as well as human rights struggle under various dictatorships. In Estelle's nuanced account of intellectuals and activists, we see incredibly complicated negotiations between past and present here and there. If Holocaust memory and testimony invigorated struggles against political repression and its aftermath, for example, it was also used to cast suspicion on human rights activists, such as the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. The mothers are key representatives of, of a demand to return disappeared children and a duty to remember them. So they really represent a kind of human rights claim as well as a memorial claim. But prominent intellectuals compared the mothers to Holocaust survivor witnesses, in fact, in order to discredit their claims. And that's a really interesting chapter in your book. Throughout the chapters of the book, established debates in Holocaust studies take on really unpredictable forms and valences, whether it's the relationship between memory and history, the possibility of poetry, if not language, after catastrophe, the particular inflection of Holocaust testimony by Latin American testimonio, debates on civilization and barbarism, genocide and modernity, the promises and limits of comparison itself, the place of affect in memorial and political practices. All of these issues are illuminated in new and vivid ways as Estelle Tarica portrays the circulation of Holocaust consciousness in Latin America. So thank you. I learned so much from your book, and I really enjoyed every page. And I just wanted to maybe start a conversation, but just asking you, how did you even come upon this subject?
Thank you, Debarati, for that amazing introduction and description of the book. And thank you to the Townsend Center for this opportunity, and to all of you for being here. It's been a long time since I've had an in-person presentation. And I know what it means to actually go to a new place, go to a place that you haven't been to in a while, and walk here. So the question of how I came to this is sort of both a kind of personal question. This book is not a personal book, but it does have a personal backstory that every now and then surfaces, which is that I'm kind of grew up in a situation in a family that was very steeped in Holocaust memory, and have a kind of attunement to that in everything that I see and read. And in all of the readings that I've done on Latin America over the course of 30 plus years as a scholar of the region, I have not seen, or I did not see very many references to the Holocaust, but eventually started to track moments where it was coming up and make a mental note of them, and then wonder if these very disparate moments were adding up to anything. And when I finished my first book, I thought, well, this might be a time to look go back, look at those mental notes and explore them and see where do they lead me. And a kind of key moment for that was interacting with a book that came out maybe in the early 2000s by the historian Leo Spitzer, who wrote about his family's experience as German-speaking Jewish refugees in Bolivia. Excuse me, and German-speaking Jews, Austrian and German Jews had a sort of very narrow window after the Kristallnacht pogrom, had a very narrow window that allowed those with means to escape, to leave those areas. And Bolivia ended up offering a haven through a constellation of circumstances, including just sort of like consular activities and the kinds of stories that you see across Europe in those years. But so Spitzer writes a lot about, he wrote a book about his family's experience there, about growing up there. And it really sort of sparked a question about what it means to talk about the Holocaust or to remember the Holocaust from a Latin American context. And all of the strengths, but also sort of, to my mind, like limitations of that book really got me thinking about how one would create an intricate enough web that could do justice to that location and to the Holocaust sort of at the same time. And your work on memory knots has been one of the formative sort of framing devices that has helped me think about how to connect such really disparate places and events, and to think about a memory knot as sort of an object that you can actually study, to think about it as an aesthetic object, also as something that may shed new light, that may be fascinating in its own right, but also sort of the scholarly drive to undo the knot and trace each line out and sort of smooth out and separate all of these lines. And so I think the book is really doing both things. It's looking for the knots. It's in a sense trying to honor their existence as a very knotted and confused reality, but also wanting to trace out how did this knot come into being? And so I really do owe a debt of gratitude, because the question of how to think about Holocaust memory on a global stage can very quickly become diluted in broad and sort of diffuse terms. And so it's really great to have images that help us think about the intersections between, let's call them global and local histories or moments. And the idea of a knot, the idea of memories or experiences that become unmoored from their original location and sort of drift or move or can be found in other locations, which is another one of the images. So yeah, that's one way to talk about how I came to this topic.
Well, I mean, it really is the case that like each chapter takes this sequence of knots and just so carefully unravels them with such meticulous care. I mean, that really is kind of part of your methodology. And I'm wondering, I mean, it's really interesting your decision to actually talk about Holocaust consciousness rather than, you know, the legacy of the Nazi genocide. I mean, we'll get to the term Holocaust later, but, you know, consciousness rather than memory or history or legacy. And I wonder if this would be a good time to maybe talk about that.
Sure, right. So one of the books that I read that sort of helped me with this idea of Holocaust consciousness is Kristen Fermaglick's book about Holocaust consciousness in the US in the 1950s and 60s. It's not a book that's been as widely read as other books about the Americanization of the Holocaust, but it's quite useful. And What I really like about the term Holocaust consciousness is that it allows me to sort of sidestep completely whether, like, sort of what is memory and what is history, and am I talking about history or memory? And I just want to be able to talk about the Holocaust and all of those different facets, however it might appear. Does it appear because we're talking about a survivor and a survivor and their children and forms of post-memory? Does it appear because people have been reading Hannah Arendt and Lyotard, because they've seen Lanzmann's Shoah? You know, how all of these diverse ways that people come into contact with the Holocaust as an event. And so consciousness is just a much more capacious way for me to address that. And it's true that the distinction or the tension between history and memory has been something that I've thought about a lot. And the work of Yosef Yerushalmi was quite important to me in terms of being able to recapture memory as from a Jewish tradition as a sort of deep well that is filled with critical potential, and to think about the dialogue between history and memory as being much more confused in a way than we tend to think, where historians will say, well, we provide the critical and distanced view against a more immediate or reified collective memory. I think, in fact, that when you start to look at any of these instances, you see that the possibility of memory as a source of critique, as a source of reflection, is quite powerful.
And also, I mean, it seems like consciousness also does in some way invoke the unconscious too. And I'm thinking here about your discussion of, Rigoberta Menchú, and how, in fact, Dory Lobb in the American context actually provided some of the frameworks that led to a defense of the veracity of her own testimony. And I wondered if this might be something that...
Right. So this is a really interesting convergence that I started to work at as I was writing the book and exploring different primary sources and different contexts, and which is the convergence between Holocaust testimony and testimonio, revolutionary testimonio, and finding moments when there was an actual conversation, as in the case of Menchú, and then moments where one could speculate about a conversation, just because the timing. I mean, if you could sort of visualize a map or these lines that converge into a kind of knot, you can see that around the time that revolutionary testimonio in Latin America sort of becomes a recognized genre of its own, through liberation theology, through the idea of biblical testimony becoming political testimony, becoming a form of consciousness raising, and then taken up by revolutionary institutions like Cuba's Casa de las Americas as a literary genre. So that's happening in the 60s and early 70s. And literally that is exactly the decade when Holocaust testimony as a kind of genre, as a source for Holocaust awareness, is becoming more recognized. This is the post-Eichmann moment, the moment after the Eichmann trial in the early 60s, when for the first time, Jewish survivors of the death camps and other Holocaust scenarios testify at a trial with the idea that their testimony, it may or may not provide actual legal evidence, but more so that it provides a context and an awareness of the stakes of Eichmann's crimes. And then there were other trials in the 60s. There were trials in Frankfurt against Auschwitz perpetrators So really, it can't be a coincidence, it seems to me, that revolutionary testimonial and Holocaust testimony are kind of gaining ground as recognized genres in the same period. And then to find that there are Latin Americans who are reading Holocaust testimony and who are themselves engaged in testimonial practices against state violence. And the case of Menchu is really interesting because I don't think she herself came from any Holocaust consciousness, and the revolutionary consciousness that she displays in her testimonial does not have a kind of Holocaust valencing. But the way it's circulated in the US really required or called on the US sort of confrontation with Holocaust testimony. And so just to the kind of shared context of genocide denialism, which sparked a lot of work with Holocaust survivors in dialogue with historians I'm thinking about the work of the Yale Testimony Project, the Fortunoff Archive, where very deep and psychoanalytically inflected engagement with Holocaust survivors led to concerns about how that very deep engagement, even with the unconscious of testimony, might unwittingly lead to issues with might unwittingly give ammunition to genocide denialism, because when you start looking that deeply at a testimony, you see the internal tensions, maybe internal contradictions, things that aren't said. Maybe some of the details don't match the historical record. And yet these are speaking a truth. And so how do you codify that truth? So anyway, this is sort of getting into the weeds here of that moment, but it's a really interesting convergence in the 90s when you see Latin American scholars defend the veracity of Rigoberta Menchu's testimony against genocidal denialist claims against her by appealing to research on Holocaust survivor testimony and talking about a non-verifiable truth, a truth that's not the same as a journalistic truth, a truth that testifies to an experience that might not survive legal scrutiny, but that is nevertheless true.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting moment because this is a time where something like it is it? No, it's not the Fortunoff Archives. Is it? No, but the American kind of approach to testimony actually provokes a kind of an opening of the frame. I mean, actually sort of authenticates, or is used to authenticate. But it's also interesting that throughout the book, you talk about Americanized Holocaust memory on the one hand and Latin Americanized. And there's one sentence that I love about how, I mean, the relationship or the influences move both ways in that, as much as some of your Latin American figures are drawing on American style Holocaust studies and testimonial reflection, there's almost an invitation. You say at one point that there's a dilution of politicized Latin American modes of testimony into a globalized American style Holocaust testimony. So on the other hand, the US or the Americanized Holocaust testimony is a kind of depoliticized, victim-centric, and somehow, depoliticized. And I wondered if you wanted to say more about that, and if you see that tension still operative today. Are we still in the Schindler's Listification of the Holocaust?
Right. I don't know the answer to that last question, but I will say that, so one element of the Americanization of the Holocaust is its Hollywoodization, its commercialization, the Holocaust miniseries that was aired in the late 70s and which circulated in Latin America in a very particular way, is, you know, way more than Schindler's List, a sort of epitome of how you could present a very palatable version of the Holocaust that maybe sentimentalizes it and leaves people feeling like, yeah, you know, things are going to be okay. And it made a lot of mistakes in terms of the stories that it tried to dramatize. Anyway, that's a whole other separate story, the Holocaust miniseries. But getting back to this question of the extent to which Holocaust memory is politicized, I think when you ask that question from the perspective of Argentina or Guatemala or Mexico, as I do in the book, you get a really different answer than if you ask that question from the US or Israel or France or Germany. And so many of the frameworks for understanding how Holocaust memory is or is not a political act are taking these European, especially European contexts as frames, and the story just looks really different. So one common concern about Holocaust memory as a depoliticizing memory is that it tells the story of World War II that eliminates some of the ideological grounds, right? The kind of context of fascist and anti-fascist movements that were deeply, you know, part of the weave of the war, and that in fact were deeply woven into Holocaust memory for many, many years. It was Holocaust memory as it emerged, even sort of during the war and immediately after, was very inflected by the events around the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which were extremely partisan, even in their moment. The question of which political parties were at the forefront of the rebellion and so on and so forth. It was a very ideological memory. But that ideological element sort of starts to fade away in the post-war period, and this innocent victim emerges. The person who was persecuted for not for any ideas that they held or for any actions, but just by virtue of having been Jewish. And when you and so I'm thinking of Enzo Traverso's work. In fact, a presentation that he gave here a few years ago really sort of crystallized for me this debate between a victim-centric approach to the Holocaust and one that could allow us to put it back into dialogue with the question of anti-fascist resistance.
And that's interesting because some of the figures that you discuss are, well, I mean, your chapters on Argentina are so fascinating in that, in a way, though, repoliticizing I mean, they're kind of restoring the complexity of the victim figure, which ends up being so. Sorry, let me get to this from another angle. You're interested in complexity as you unravel these knots in these different places, and also the complicities that emerge. I mean, that seems to be like one of the themes that kind of runs through, especially in the Argentinian chapters, where you have Jewish associations that are actually complicit with the junta. And such, and so this connection between the complexity of someone's positioning in relationship to greater force, the fact that they can be a victim but also an agent of political struggle, that seems to have led some of the figures in your book to really kind of, you know, have questions to use Holocaust memory in a way that somehow compromises or misreads or indicts some of these victims of state violence who themselves were agents in liberation struggles. So I wondered if that's something there are examples you might want to.
Right. So in Argentina, there are these really interesting memory debates in the 90s and the 2000s. This is the dictatorship formally ended in 1983. There were some trials against perpetrators, military perpetrators of the dirty war. And then the political scene shifted and there was a wave of impunity measures that sort of decided to clear the slate and give amnesty to perpetrators. And then new revelations, new evidence came out, and the question sort of became hot again, you know, and so there's a lot of really fascinating intellectual work that happens in that period by most of them are former leftist militants who are now taking a stand in the memory debates of the moment and really mining Holocaust philosophy, post-Holocaust philosophy, Holocaust testimony. They're reading Primo Levi, they're watching Lanzmann Shoah, they track the historians' debate in Germany around the relativization of Nazi crimes once they're put next to Stalin's crimes. And they mine that archive in order to stake an intellectual, almost like a sort of pure intellectual position against the messy testimonial, so oftentimes strident politics of human rights groups who are just insisting on speaking the truth of the disappearances, on the criminality of the state. And these, so you have the case of someone like Beatriz Sarlo, who is just one of the most interesting and sort of idiosyncratic thinkers, so widely read, very influential voice in post-dictatorship Argentina, who will take Argentine survivors of the detention centers there, who either give their testimony orally or who have written testimony, take them to task by comparing them to Primo Levi's testimony and saying, you know, Levi never does what you do, which is you center on yourself as a sufferer, and Levi never does that. And so if you were actually going to be taking up the Holocaust as a model, you would follow Levi. But in fact, you can't take the Holocaust up as a model because it is so different and so exceptional. And so that almost sort of punitive use of Holocaust testimony as a kind of silencing mechanism. It's quite, it's fascinating.
It really is fascinating. I just one last question before we open it up. I'm wondering if you could, I'm just really curious because, you know, like Claude Lanzmann refused the term Holocaust because of its etymological root as sacrificial burnt offerings, which kind of potentially inscribes what is an inconceivable and unpardonable catastrophe, right? In some way redeems it. And so he chooses Shoah. But it's so interesting throughout your book that the various voices within it themselves do use Holocaust. I'm thinking specifically of the chapter on the Mayan Holocaust or the Mayan genocide in the mirror of the Holocaust. And I wondered if you could say a few words about if there was any debate, because you have such an incredible, like there's a really powerful examination of the term genocide, and it's used in Guatemala that basically link genocide to coloniality. And this is, you know, a very sort of separate circulation of ideas from, say, you know, the way Hannah Arendt or Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire are kind of connecting genocide to coloniality. But the term Holocaust seems to be a constant throughout the various chapters and the various sites that you examine. And I'm just really curious about that, given the debates around the term.
So I think there's sort of two questions that come up around that term or around my use of the term. And one is whether it is possible to think about redemption in the shadow of the Holocaust. And the other is sort of the weight that we give semantic origins in terms of the discourse that we use. And on that last question, I think it's always really important and to understand the etymology of a word. But I think that the usage of the term as it circulates is equally as significant or impactful, and that insisting on the etymological significance of a word may sort of end up completely ignoring all sorts of other significances that circulate. So that would be one reason why I think you can use the word Holocaust without automatically calling to mind the idea of a burnt offering that is completely consumed at the temple. And as to how it is that is the term that got taken up, that is sort of a speculative question. I think it does have to do with the popularization of the term through the media, way more so than Shoah. And then the question of redemption, this is a really knotted and thorny point that I come back to over and over again in my own thinking about these examples, which is that the Latin American experience of genocide, one of the ways that people have responded and resisted it and has been to try and engage or re-engage the question of futurity, the question of being able to come out the other end of this and still capture some of the ethos, some of the ideas that drove the conflicts that led to genocide. That basically I'm talking about sort of the left wing and progressive intellectual, organizational, activist impulse that undergirds testimonio, and that is the predominant way of grasping the Holocaust in Latin America, which is to think about that these memory practices and testimonial practices are able to stitch something back together that has been shattered and destroyed. And that is something that it is much harder to do with respect to the Jewish Holocaust. That is, most Holocaust testimony does not lend itself to a redemptive reading of history. And I think being able to see both of those things, to see what for some people might be a Latin American misreading of Holocaust testimony, that seems to me to be of quite deep interest. And it seems that it may also impact future generations of Holocaust testimony as those continue to evolve, and how we grasp those.
We can open it up to questions from the audience. There's a mic circulating. It's an entanglement. I mean, I can keep asking. Oh. Truly not. There you go.
There were so many great questions that came to mind when I was reading this book. It was fantastic, and thank you for your talk. But also, I guess, I don't know if this, hopefully it doesn't just restate the question earlier around consciousness, but I think a couple times in the book, and I don't know if it's a complete synonym, the word sort of awareness comes up. And I think for me, and maybe this also has to do with your last comment, I'm curious about what that term awareness or consciousness, like what they do for you in useful ways variously around the question of the connection between like aesthetics and then like action. And it doesn't seem to me in your book that you're sort of claiming that these various uses of memory sort of just inherently creates, or that the consciousness sort of immediately creates some kind of redemptive action or political so I don't know if that's not really a fully formed question, but I guess I'm just wondering why that term was important to you instead of sort of leaping immediately to certain kinds of forms producing action. Does that make sense?
What do you mean by forms producing action?
The sense that if we simply, in a kind of like human rights approach, just like make people aware of a problem, then that awareness in fact is the problem, and that once awareness happens, that it will be corrected, right? Which is kind of behind a lot of forms of human rights based work in some kind of deeper level, but it doesn't seem that that's like what you're pointing to in this book.
Right. So in a way, are you asking sort of what's my take on whether this Latin American Holocaust consciousness is a redemptive intervention itself?
Yeah, and or operative.
Right. So that's a hard question. I guess one of the things that happened as I was working on this book is that I sort of I kind of have a tendency to delve into each voice and sort of inhabit it and then maybe agree with it. And then I have to come out the other side and recapture like a critical perspective on it. And one of the hardest sort of mini journeys of that kind of pathway that I engaged with had to do with human rights speech in Argentina, which can sometimes be quite flat and very declarative. And maybe what you're talking about are sort of what's the impact of these declarative statements, I found that the impact of the declarative statement may not have been that significant in the moment. It's more from a certain distance when you start to add that up. It's more that it's testifying to a disposition, to a predisposition, to a linkage, to a sense of what it is that the Holocaust, how the Holocaust can be meaningful in the moment, what it could do for activism in the moment, way more so than the actual utterance, the utterance of saying, we Argentines lived through a mini Holocaust, which is, one of these famous utterances, or the ESMA, which was an infamous torture center, detention center. The ESMA is our Auschwitz. Some of those may land with a kind of explosive force, but maybe not. So yeah, I don't know. I think some of the aesthetic impacts that it's quite differentiated. Let's put it this way. Some things seem to me to be quite powerful, quite beautiful in terms of the kind of knot they create, and others are more interesting just as almost like historical symptoms. maybe a bit of an abstract answer to your question.
Well, it seems like it's the not versus the logic of identity in direct analogy, right? And you're interested in, your interest in consciousness is actually saying it's not about direct analogy,
I think,
something like that.
right. I mean, I think the analogies are really important, but what's more interesting is the story that you have to tell in order to understand how this analogy was made possible. How did it come to be that Maya intellectuals referred to the Maya genocide as a Holocaust, and not just a Holocaust, but the third Maya Holocaust? And so understanding sort of the backstory to that utterance, to me is what sort of opens onto a whole new vista of Holocausts, a whole new chapter in understanding the legacy of the Holocaust. And a whole new chapter, sorry, in understanding the legacy of the Guatemalan genocide.
I'm trying to turn this not into a question that I have in my head. I'm curious as to like what we get or what they produce, Latin American intellectuals, the authors, the artists that you look at, when they use the trope or the framework of the Holocaust and where they're trying to get to. So the question of redemption has come up and whether that's possible or not. Is it to linger with the trauma, to be in that, to move beyond that? So I'm wondering, beyond adopting the Holocaust and then actually echoing, as you just said right now, what they describe, some of these Mayan intellectuals describe as previous to the first and second Holocaust or genocides. It seems like there's a larger kind of conceptual structure here of Holocaust, these various kinds of genocides, and where they're trying to feel their way into or out through something. And I'm trying to get a sense of where that place is, that destination of what they hope to arrive at. Whether it's through thinking of the Holocaust or and especially thinking about the previous genocides also. How all of that is trying to get us somewhere and what that somewhere might be.
Right. Thank you, Raul, for that question. So I guess, right, I've been thinking about these as converging lines, converging histories, but a basic presupposition, let's say, for all of these Holocaust references in Latin America is that the Holocaust is the one genocidal event that is a kind of settled question. We know it happened and we've condemned it as a world. Of course, in many ways, it is not a settled question. It is not universally condemned. We can get into that, but that is the idea that most of the Latin American sources who invoke the Holocaust, they're starting from that idea. And so part of what they're doing is saying, just as we condemn the Holocaust, so should we condemn this genocide. That the death of Maya at the hands of the army is just as important, worthy of remembrance, and worthy of reparation as the Jewish genocide in Europe. And so that is part of the structure, is that almost belated or second chapter, of Holocaust legacy, which is to grasp this idea that because it's come in through whether mass media representations, the role of Israel and geopolitics is also kind of a thread that one could trace, which is that one in using that word, the Maya intellectuals that use it, in a sense, are claiming a global stage that has been denied them. So that's just the most immediate answer to your question, is that it turns an event that has been either denied or censored or localized or justified into a crime, and it does so for a global audience.
I think that it's 1 o'clock and, right? Yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you so much, Estelle, for writing this book.